So Genesis chapter 14, and we're going to be reading the first 16 verses. And it came to pass in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elashah, Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, Tidal, king of nations, that they made war with Bera, king of Sodom, Birish, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Adam, Shemba, king of Zeboim, and Baal, that is Zorah. These joined together in the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. 12 years they served Kedorlaomer, and in the 13th year they rebelled. They served Kedorlaomer 13 years. 12 years they served Kedorlaomer, and in the 13th year they rebelled. In the 14th year, Kedorlaomer and the kings that were with him came and attacked Rehoboam in Ashtaroth, Canaan, the Zulam in Ham, the Emin in Shavan, Kiryathaim, and the Horats in the mountain of Seir, as far as El Param, which is in the wilderness. And they turned back and came to En-Mishpath, that is Kadesh, and they attacked all the country of the Amalekites, and also the Amorites, which dwelt in Hazon Tamar. The king of Sodom, and the king of Gomorrah, and the king of Adam, and the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, went out and joined together in battle in the valley of Siddim, against Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, Tidal, king of nations, Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elashah. 4 kings against 5. Now the valley of Siddim was full of asphalt pits, and the kings of Sodom and the kings of Gomorrah fled. Some fell there, and the remainder fled to the mountains. They took all the goods. Then they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah, and all the provisions, and went their way. They also took Lot, Abraham's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and all his goods, and departed. Then the one who had escaped came and told Abraham the Hebrew, for he dwelt by the terebinth trees in Mamre, the Amorite brother of Eshcol, the brother of Aner, and they were allies with Abram. Then Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, and he armed his 318 trained servants, who were born in his own house, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. He divided his forces against them by night. He and his servants attacked them, and pursued them as far as Hobath, which is north of Damascus. So he brought back all the goods, and also brought back his brother Lot and his goods, as well as the woman and the people. So reads the word of God. We're now going to sing hymn 481, Sing We the King Who is Coming to Reign.
Coming to
And I had hoped to have a PowerPoint presentation to show you, but unfortunately I can't get my laptop to talk to the the projector there. So, well, hopefully better than nothing. But I'm going to turn my laptop round so some of you may be able to see it, and anyone who's interested can come up later and have a look. When that decides to cooperate anyway. So, we've been studying the life of Abraham, and we come now to a point where the international geopolitical situation interrupts the scene, interrupts the story. Here we go. So, I'm going to be able to see it as well. So the points I want to be able to cover this evening is looking at some of the history and the background to the events in this chapter, and then looking at the invaders, where they were coming from, what we know about them, and then also the defenders, and then hopefully some points of application, so that won't just be dry history. And then we'll be looking at the believers' engagement in the world and what lessons we have from that, and then also looking at an imagery of Abraham as a saviour in the passage that we read. Okay, so the historical setting. The events in pretty much most of the Old Testament take place in what is known in history as the Fertile Crescent. For those of you who have maps in the back of your Bible, it might be more easier to have a look there. But essentially what you have is you have the Persian Gulf, and then feeding into that down from modern-day Turkey, you have two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. And between that, you had what is known as Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers. And then flowing down in, obviously very politically charged, what area of land you call it nowadays, but we'd call it the Promised Land in biblical terminology. So you have the Mediterranean coast on one side, and you have the Jordan running parallel to it. And then you also have in Egypt, obviously you have the Nile running down Africa. And so if you look, those form a sort of crescent together, and hence the Fertile Crescent, because next to the rivers you had farming land and land which people could then build up cities and civilizations around. Hence why it is also known as the cradle of civilization. And throughout Old Testament history, and in fact time-wise most of history really, you had a pretty constant civilization in Egypt. And then in this northern area here in Mesopotamia, all the way up from Turkey, modern-day Turkey, down to the Persian Gulf, you had along there various empires which rose and fell. And this then gives us the context for much of the Old Testament history there, because you end up with the children of Israel living here, basically between two empires who constantly were invading either from the north or the south, and then the temptation was always to look to help from the one that wasn't invading you against the one that was, rather than trusting in God. And I think it is a helpful point here to bear in mind that when we read about Abraham being called out of the land of his fathers, it's often easy to imagine him being called out into the middle of nowhere to set up a new kingdom there. And certainly Abraham was being called to a nomadic lifestyle, calling away from all he knew as comfortable. But it wasn't that God was calling him out of civilization, completely out of the world. He was in fact putting him right bang in the middle of these empires which were going to fall and rise right around him. So Abraham wasn't being called out of the world, he was in fact being called right into the middle of it. And This meant that Israel was in the middle of world history, essentially up to and even beyond the time of the gospel, so that God's plan of salvation could operate in this essentially crossroads of the world. And then when the Messiah had come and when the gospel was ready to go out into the world, it was then able to spread out across the infrastructure that the empires had already got in place there. So it was able to spread both east and west. And this passage we read where we have this great big army of invading and coming into the land, I think it helps provide context for what Abraham later says in Genesis 15, where he asks God in 15 verse 8, "Lord, how shall I know that I shall inherit the land?" The immediate context there is obviously that at the time he doesn't have any children, so how can he inherit the land without any children? But also possibly in his mind is, well, even if I have children, I'm living in a place where these armies are going to come crashing in every so often. How are my inheritance going to be able to hold on to this land? And it is essentially by God's grace that the children of Israel were able to hold on to the land. I mentioned that in Egypt, obviously you've got the Nile there providing a stable basis for the civilization. And along the Mesopotamia there, you have these different empires rising and falling. But in the Promised Land, really, there wasn't, apart from David and his kingdom, there wasn't really a great empire which rose and spread out from there. In many ways, the geography wasn't as suited as it was in these other places to forming an empire. It's a much smaller location. The River Jordan is small by comparison to these other rivers which were bringing water and nutrients, and therefore able to support a smaller population. And therefore, people in this territory were always destined to be smaller and less powerful than the empire surrounding them. It is therefore, it requires God's grace and protection then for them to thrive and survive in that situation and to remain and to keep their independence. So that's the broader historical setting. So then coming on to all these different kings and where they're coming from. So it starts with King Amraphel, king of Shinar. So Shinar, we believe, is another way of referring to Mesopotamia, which, as I say, is the land between the two rivers there. And it's noted in the Bible that this is the location of the Tower of Babel, where that is built. And it's also in other passages associated with where the children of Israel are going to be taken into exile. In other words, the connotations aren't exactly great for this area. As to Amraphel, people, with each of these kings, people try and associate them with known kings in history. There is a famous king in the ancient Near East called Hammurabi, who produced a law code, which is comparable in some ways to the laws that Moses provided. And because he's a person people know, people like to associate, this Amraphel must be associated with this person. But the scholarship there just isn't particularly convincing. Similarly with Kedorlaomer, king of Elam. So Elam is a kingdom we do know about. It's here right next to Mesopotamia, bordering it, just above the Persian Gulf there. And so that is an ancient kingdom. And Kedorlaomer does sound like a name from that kingdom, but beyond that, we don't have any real historical notions of that. Kedar meaning a servant or worshipper of, and Laomer being one of their gods. So it is a pagan name, as indeed many of the Jewish names are related to the worship of Yahweh. And if you think it sounds a bit sketchy as to how much we know about those kings, it's even worse with the other ones, I'm afraid. In that they're allies. So, so Tidal, king of nations. Again, it's almost complete guesswork as to what exactly these nations were and to what kind of name Tidal is and where it comes from or what it means. There are some theories, one possibility being that he was ruling different groups of tribes or coalition of the Hittites, or maybe some other group from the mountain ranges there. If that's so, he's representing a coalition within a coalition in this grouping. And then Arak, king of Elisha, again, there are attempts to associate him with a minor king within the kingdom of Babylon there. But again, that's largely conjecture. But before we move on, the point to note of this is that these were quite large areas following, so king of so Elam and Mesopotamia. Obviously, you have to say we don't necessarily know about the other kingdoms, but potentially this is quite a large landmass compared to the kings of the valley. So if we're looking at the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah and their allies, it is a bit debated where the Sodom and Gomorrah were. Some people say it was north of the Dead Sea, some people say it's actually under where the Dead Sea is now. The best here, archaeological evidence and historical evidence, we would say, is actually to have them in the plain south of the Dead Sea. They're sort of there in a row next to the hills on the valley. There is a link to a YouTube video there which looks at the locating Sodom and Gomorrah, and also looking at the sort of the burning and their destruction and the archaeology around there. So that's quite interesting to look into. But obviously that's jumping ahead a bit in our narrative. And so as I was saying before, the invaders seem to be coming from quite a wide area and therefore probably able to muster quite a large army. Whereas these kings here were each kings within their own city-state, and quite possibly their entire coalition represented just one of the kings which were invading them. We might ask then, why did they think it was a good idea to rebel? Maybe they thought that enough time had passed and that they could be forgotten about if they just let their tribute slide. Or maybe they thought that they were secure with the level of distance and the amount of logistical difficulties it would take to invade them. And also we need to remember that previously Lot had looked up and looked at the valley. So in Genesis 13 verse 10, Lot lifted his eyes and saw the plain of the Jordan, and it was well watered everywhere, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, and like the land of Egypt, as you go towards Zoar. And so as I mentioned before, the Nile there, being well watered, provided the base for a stable civilization which became powerful. And Mesopotamia, to get into another disputed topic, where the Garden of Eden, suggested site for it is down here around the Persian Gulf, which was well watered. So that's maybe what it's referring to when it's saying well watered, like the Garden of the Lord. So here the text of the Bible is comparing this valley with these sites which were basis for powerful empires and civilizations. And so maybe these kings looked around at what they had and thought, yes, we have got enough here to be a basis for our own kingdom, and we can establish ourselves independent of Chedorlaomer and his coalition. And yes, this map's really too small to be much use on the laptop. But essentially, the point I wanted to make here was when we read about the different locations that Chedorlaomer and his invading army go to when they go round, they essentially come down the one side of the mountains on the side of the Jordan, invading the different towns and kingdoms there. They then loop round the bottom and come back up from the south. and are then approaching from the west towards it. So they've essentially done this encircling motion following round, so that they've exactly why they're attacking all these other towns isn't said in the text. It could be that these were potential allies who might come to the Five Kings' aid, or it might be that they were simply taking the opportunity to expand their own territories and establishing their rights over these groups as well. Or maybe they were just a convenient way to find supplies for their army. But when we come to the battle, they have encircled the Five Kings and cut them off. And with these other two maps here, just the point I wanted to make is that it's a similar pattern we find then through history, both with Sennacherib's invasion, where he comes down and he's going from town to town, destroying it before he then encircles Jerusalem. So it's almost like you make a point of destroying all these minor places before you then go and encircle your main aim. And so you make sure your army's secure, so you're not going to be attacked from the side. And then also, probably even more similarly to this current location, with Nebuchadnezzar's invasion, where he comes down. And so rather than just marching straight to the location you're attacking, you go around to each significant strategic place, you secure it, and you conquer, and you set your mark there. And so this invasion we read about in this passage, it is following the biblical pattern of invasion that we know about, whereby the dominant power comes down into the land, secures the area, then aims for its main target. And it's useful to bear this in mind when we consider maybe the historiography of these events we're reading about in this passage. Obviously with so little supporting evidence of any kind, well, essentially no supporting evidence from external archaeology for the events in this passage, it's easy for people to question whether these events ever happened, especially as modern scholarship itself questions the very existence of Abraham. And they would say, at best, this is a remembering of an event which may have taken place, but the details have got somewhat confused. Obviously, we accept, from the Bible, we accept these events as having happened as they're described. But I do not think we need to insist on them in the same way as we would insist on, say, the death, burial and resurrection of Jesus, for which we can provide a very good historical defence of. In terms of this event, we say that it's perfectly possible that it could have happened. It follows the historical patterns of things that happened. It follows the geology of what we know in the area, and therefore there's no need or reason to doubt it from history, even if we can't support it and confirm it from history. And so that's looking maybe a bit more of a negative side of it, but I do think there is a useful, important point to be drawn from this ambiguity, to be drawn from the fact that these kings are a bit of a mystery and we don't really know very much about them. And the fact is this, for the Bible, it is the account of salvation which is important. We read, so if we look at verse 12, where we read, "They also took Lot, Abraham's brother and son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed." I think if it wasn't for that verse there and what happened there, I don't think this entire account would be in the Bible, because it's only that these kings, in their aims and their plans, ended up capturing Lot, who was the nephew of Abraham, who was then God's chosen person to have favour on. It's only because of that then this entire narrative becomes relevant. Reading through the narrative, from someone who's more interested in, say, military history or the social political things, there are actually a lot of details that are completely absent and missing. You have this massive build-up to this battle which is going to take place between all these kings, and before you know it, it's over. It goes from saying they met for battle and then the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled. No real details of the actual size of the armies, no details of the morale of the troops, the kind of weaponry they used, the tactics. So from a military history point of view, it's actually quite disappointing. But the point that the Bible is interested in is it's interested in telling the story of salvation, the salvation specifically of Lot in this instance, and then the story of salvation, which runs through the whole Bible, which incorporates Abraham and the promises made to him. And so compared to that story, these kings, they're just a by-note, they're just a footnote in the grand scheme of things. At the time, this would have seemed like the major event of the day. We can't necessarily say how often these types of invasions would happen. It's been at least over a decade before this happened before, given how long the kings had been in service before they rebelled. And So this great event, which at the time would have been the news of the day, you can imagine down in Egypt, the Pharaoh's council would have been gathering around to discuss it. They would say, okay, does this mean that this rising kettle aroma, this is someone we really need to worry about now? Or is this an opportunity that the land's now weak, that we could press our case and gain some influence there? Would they perhaps be worried about refugees coming in and what kind of pressures that might cause? So all these things would have been closely followed by the Egyptians at the time and by the others. So this would have, at the time, this would have been the major dominating factor. But for us, this is just the back show with an interruption in the story of the life of Abraham. And as I say, these kings are pretty much otherwise completely forgotten to history, and they're only here now because of their involvement in the life of Abraham. And I think that's an important thing to remember for us today. We can get so caught up with the events which are going on at the moment. We've had the Arab Spring, followed by the war in Tunisia with Gaddafi getting thrown over, which then also led to the war in Syria, which has only just concluded over a decade later. We've got the war in Ukraine, we've got the war in Israel, and we've got Iran's support and Russia's involvement with all these different areas. And there seems that there's so much going on, and we get so involved with the details and wondering what all these things mean, and forget that these are just different parts and components in God's overall plan of salvation. I think it's important to remember what Jesus says in Mark and Matthew. But when you hear of wars and rumours of wars, do not be troubled, for such things must happen, but the end is not yet. And I find it a bit disappointing sometimes when Christians get hung up on Jesus' prediction of wars and rumours of wars. So, well, you see, Jesus predicted it and it's happening, so therefore that validates what Jesus said. It's like, well, yes, but you could say that about any time in history that there are going to be wars and rumours of wars. The important point, I believe, of what Jesus is making is, do not be troubled by these things. These are things which are part of God's plan. These are not the events in which we're to get obsessed over and seeking to follow. And also the historical reality changes. I've spent a while, maybe a bit too long, talking about Mesopotamia and the historical background to these events in the New Testament, in the Old Testament, sorry. And that state of affairs was essentially in play for several millennia, much longer than the modern state of the world has been around. And yet that historical reality changed. First with the rise of Alexander the Great, and then with the rise of the Roman Empire. And then the rise of Islam again shaped the world, and then with the modernization of Europe and its empires, the historical reality of the world has completely changed again. So all these things of which people obsess over, they're all temporary, they're all going to pass. They may be interesting in the moment, and they have a major part on people's lives, but they are all transient compared with the kingdom of Christ, which is going to be established and never be challenged or changed. And just a quote from Isaiah, "Behold, all the nations are as a drop in the bucket, and are counted as small on the dust of the scales. Look, he lifts up the islands as a very little thing." So just remember that whenever anyone's going on too much about Donald Trump and the President of the USA being the most important man in the world, and all the worries about that sort of thing, all the worries about those issues which get raised. And so now as we move on to the second half of our passage, and considering the actual rescue that occurs, and I think this is a useful time to consider the believer's engagement in the world. Obviously, in previous study sessions, we have looked at how Abraham gave Lot the choice of where he wanted to live, whether to go down and plains or into the other parts of the land. And Lot decided to go amongst the plains where there was this rich agriculture, where there were these cities, where it was developed and life was much more convenient. And so Lot decided to entangle himself with the world, whereas Abraham ended up with the poorer, less arable land. And almost immediately afterwards, Lot, having entangled himself, not only living around Sodom, we now find is living in Sodom, and having entangled himself in the affairs of the world then come crashing in on him, and he finds himself a captive, being taken away prisoner in an army. Abraham, by the other hand, who has maintained his nomadic lifestyle, seems to have escaped scot-free of this swath of destruction which is spread through the land. So this might immediately suggest that, well, it's better then to have as little involvement with the world as possible. Let the world go and do its own thing, and we'll live as hermits, trying to sort of remain uncontaminated as possible. But I think a closer reading of the passage suggests that Abraham wasn't in fact entirely detached from the world, and wasn't simply living the life of a hermit, unconnected to everything. So if we go reading from verse 13, "Then one who has escaped came and told Abraham, the Hebrew, for he dwelt in the terebinth trees of Mamre." So again, sorry I can't show this better on the map here. We read after the battle which takes place just south of the Salt Sea, the Dead Sea there. Most of the people flee into the hills and into the mountains. So that would be most likely up here onto the eastern bank. And again, with that video I referred to earlier, there are actually caves which have been discovered with pottery in from this time period, suggesting that they were used as a place of refuge. And so most of the population was probably fleeing up here into the east and mountains to try and escape there. Meanwhile, the victorious army, after plundering, would start to head north. Now, this refugee from the battle, he's actually also having to head north. So in order to reach Abraham, he's not running in the opposite direction to which this victorious army is going. He's actually running in the same direction as them in order to reach Abraham and inform him. And he's able to do this enough time for Abraham to then prepare. So it's not that he waits for everything to be close, to be completely clear and it to be safe. He's running in the same direction as Abraham. He's running in the same direction as danger in order to get to Abraham, suggesting that he viewed being with Abraham as being a safer place than simply getting as far away from the actual army which was threatening him. And next we read that Abraham was living amongst allies. And so whereas Lot had gone and lived and accommodated himself with the people of the 5 cities, Abraham was also managing to get along with the people around him. So it's not that he was disconnected with anyone living in the land, he was making allies with them. And this wasn't a simple alliance of convenience whereby, okay, I'll stay here, I won't bother you, you won't bother me. These allies were prepared to go with Abraham into battle, and not just a casual battle. This was a battle against an army which had defeated everyone else in the area and was now heading home victorious. And so when Abraham, presumably in a hurry, comes to these people saying, look, I'm running after to save my nephew Lot, can you come? And they're saying, yeah, we're off with you. So those were the kind of allies that he had. And so but he's not only reliant on his allies. We read, he armed the 318 trained servants who were in his house and went in pursuit as far as Dan. So these were not just his shepherds and his servants. These were these were trained men for which he had the arms ready to give them, and ready to give them quickly enough in able to catch up with the army. Now, it does take them a little while. Dan is quite far north within the Promised Land, and so it does take them a little while, but all the same, it shows us a level of preparedness for military affairs, that they're able to get armed and travel and catch up with this army. And then, having caught up with the pursuing army, he doesn't simply rely on luck or doesn't just leave it in the hands of the Lord to provide victory. He has his strategy. He divides his forces and makes a night attack. And he is then victorious and then pursues them as far north of Damascus. And so Abraham here is engaging with strategy. He's not simply just trusting everything will work out for the best. He is making a plan. He's using good military strategy and following it through. And so, far from Abraham being some sort of hermit, totally disconnected and incapable of dealing with the world, we see that he's a very capable figure. And yes, it is doubtless with God's help that he's able to accomplish this, but he does everything he can from a human point of view. God then elevates that and makes it successful. And so finally, I want to consider Abraham now as an image, as a saviour in this image. So Abraham has obviously kept himself separate from the city of the plain and the politics going on there and this whole invasion situation. Quite why Kedorlaomer and his allies didn't want to attack him on their circle of destruction, we don't know. Maybe that as a nomad they didn't want to spend too long trying to chase Abraham down. Or maybe they knew that Abraham and his allies had a certain disdain for the Sodomites and therefore didn't feel the need, thought there was no chance of Abraham coming to the defence of the 5 kings and their captives, and therefore thought it was safe to neglect Abraham. But either way, Abraham has no real reason to engage in this battle until he hears that it is his brother that has been taken captive. And if Abraham had been a more vindictive man, he may have thought, well, serves him right, he chose his path, he made his bed, now he can lie in it. There's nothing I can do really. I'm not going to risk my men to save this ungrateful nephew who's left me with the worst deal and now got himself into this situation. But as soon as he hears that Lot has been captured, he then makes plans to rescue him. And similarly, we see that God loves us even whilst he's no practical reason to do so. Whilst we're estranged from God, that is when God loved us and sent his son to die for us. We don't read of Lot and Abraham having had any kind of reconciliation or Lot making any kind of amends to Abraham for taking the better land. But even with that thing between them, Abraham is still willing to put his life and the life of everyone he has on the line in order to go and rescue Lot. And God likewise is prepared to put his son's life not only on the line, but to have his son die for us whilst we're still estranged from him. And then in verse 16 we read, so he brought back all the goods and also brought back his brother Lot, as well as the women and the people. So Abraham effectively gets a total victory. The enemy are fleeing before him, and he's able to rescue the people, he's able to rescue Lot, and he's able to recover all the goods. And this reminded me of the verse in Hebrews chapter 7, verse 25. Therefore he is able to save to the uttermost those who come to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. So although Abraham achieved this great victory and recovered all this stuff that had been lost, Jesus in his victory is able to recover far more. He is able to bring back all who trust in him. He is able to recover essentially the entire world when it will be made in a new creation. So just as Abraham's victory was complete, Jesus' victory is complete over a far greater enemy. Thank you. So before we come to a time of prayer, we can sing 862, When This Passing World Is Done.